Let me point you to Ecclesiastes chapter 9. There is an incredible piece of biblical wisdom that I want us to see together today from Ecclesiastes chapter 9. The wisdom writer says this in verse 11. The race is not to the swift or the battle to the strong, nor does food come to the wise or wealth to the brilliant or favor to the learned, but time and chance happen to them all. In other words, the things we typically value, physical stuff like speed and strength, or mental things like wisdom, intelligence, and education, none of that guarantees success. There are a whole lot of other factors that come into play, some of which we're going to talk about today. But before I do anything else, let me just express my deep appreciation and gratitude for the way so many of you prayed for me while I was gone. I felt the closeness of your prayer. I was strengthened by your prayers, and I truly believe it was your prayers and God's grace that sustained us while we were on this recent adventure. And it leaves me with a little challenge today. Many of you were so personally invested in this recent adventure with your prayer lives that you're ready to hear all about it. Matter of fact, people have stopped by the church. They've sent emails and called and said, can't wait till Sunday to hear Pastor talk all about his trip. Well, that's my challenge. I get 25 to 30 minutes a week to make a significant spiritual deposit in your life from Scripture, and I don't want to waste any of that on irrelevant details. So if you'll allow me briefly to address the trip, and then I want to dovetail a part of that conversation into the sermon. I boil my comments down to 4 key takeaways. There's a whole lot to be said today, or that could be said about that, but let me just talk about 4 key things. And the 4th takeaway that we just saw from Ecclesiastes 9 will capture the most of our attention today as the focus of the message. Takeaway number 1, I learned something about myself. Now, I was already kind of in my subconsciousness aware of this, but I had never really been able to put it into words, and a lot of you won't understand this. But for those of you that are wired like me, you will completely get it. They say misery loves company, so we're in this together. Here's something I learned about myself. I knew it, but I finally grasped it and realized how dangerous it can be. I feel guilty when I'm not working. I have this guilt that if I'm not doing something productive with my life in that moment, I feel guilty. Which means I have this incredibly unhealthy knack for turning everything I do into work. I can work the pleasure just about out of anything I do. I'm so goal-oriented, ambitious, and driven that the pursuit of the goal consumes me. So much so that I don't enjoy the journey. I don't live in the moment. I'm not fully present because I'm too busy trying to achieve the goal. I took a tripod stand with me on this trip for my iPhone because I had the intention of recording some men's devotionals while I was in the wilderness. I thought that would be an incredible backdrop for those devotionals. So early on the trip, I was crafting these devotions in my head as we hiked. So while we're hiking through the beauty of God's creation, my mind is not paying attention to why I'm there. I am writing devotions in my head so that when we stop, I'll have something to say to the camera. I made myself stop. I put the tripod back in the tent because I was working and not being present in the moment. I made a decision to become intentional about enjoying the experience, being in the moment, taking it all in. I slowed down. I became truly alive and fully present. I breathed slower and deeper on purpose. I stopped to savor the taste of mountain water straight from the source. My senses came alive. I listened, I saw, I truly lived. Now I got to figure out how to do that every normal day of my life. Takeaway number 2, I learned something about fun. Extreme adventurous, like the climbing community, hikers, mountain climbers, people that summit Everest, they have crafted language to describe the different types of fun. And it's actually become sociological terms that describe fun. They call it type 1 fun and type 2 fun. Type 1 fun is enjoyable. It's fun in the moment. It's exhilarating, but it doesn't last. It's kind of like riding a roller coaster. There's a rush of adrenaline. You love it while it's happening, but it doesn't mark or define your life in any way. As a matter of fact, when it's over, you move on almost it's a very forgettable thing until the next time that you do it. It doesn't last, it doesn't define your life, but it is enjoyable while you do it. Type 2 fun is actually totally, radically different. Type 2 fun can actually be miserable and painful in the moment, but the adventure shapes and defines your life, and you're going to draw from that experience for the rest of your life. It's kind of like summiting Everest. The journey to the top is treacherous. It's full of adversity, and it may even include misery and pain, but the experience you have on the journey will become a part of your story as long as you live. It will become the centerpiece of the conversations that you have for the rest of your life. The true fun of type 2 fun isn't fully realized until the adventure is over. My recent adventure was type 2 fun. I learned something about myself. I learned something about fun. Takeaway number 3, I learned something about God. One of the reasons I keep going back to the wilderness is because it humbles me. My life is recalibrated in a positive way by the wilderness because the vastness and expanse of God's creation makes me feel small and inconsequential. And for those of us that have the world revolving around us, we have iPhones and everything, we need to be put in a place every now and again that makes us feel small and inconsequential. The peaks of mountains and thunderous roaring rivers and the vastness and the ruggedness of God's creation puts me in my place. It reminds me of how small I am and how big He really is. And on this trip, my expansive, great God stepped into the vastness of His wilderness and saw the small speck of creation that I am, and He got personally involved in my life. There are so many little details that worked out just right, timing and events, that had they been off a millisecond, it would have changed everything. There would have been significant consequences. So I saw His love for me in the little things. I saw Him arranging the details for me. They were like His fingerprints, the evidence of His presence and involvement in my life. It was like the author of my story had gotten personally and intimately involved in the story with me, ironically, in the middle of this massive wilderness where I felt like one small grain of sand, and the God of the universe paid attention to that one little piece of matter. It wasn't uncommon as we hiked. I would think about those things and a smile would break out on my face as it crossed my mind. I would think to myself, He really loves me. I have His attention. I feel His embrace. I sense His approval. The God of the universe is personally involved in this little speck of matter that I am, and that's what makes me matter. I didn't grow up with a dad, and I genuinely felt that God was fathering me as a son. I don't know what that feels like any other way but that way. And I felt that. And that realization was there was a deep sense of security and rest that I found in His obvious love for me He expressed over the last few weeks. Takeaway number 4, I learned something about life. Our guide for the trip was a very experienced 24-year-old. Now, named Brandon. My friend Lance that organized it all is the guy that runs the whole thing, but he told me, whoever I put you with, you can trust. When I landed in that bush plane in the middle of nowhere, and I walked up to this guy, I looked up to him. He's a 6'4" athlete. I stuck out my hand and looked up to him, and I said, "How old are you?" He said, 24. I thought, dear God, I'm going to die out here in the middle of nowhere. I learned that couldn't have been further from the truth. This young man started surviving in the wilderness at 17. He's very experienced, and I learned by the time it was over, I would follow that young man into battle anywhere. I learned to respect him greatly. But he looked like Chris or Liam Hemsworth. Matter of fact, I actually asked him, does your last name happen to be Hemsworth? And he chuckled and said, I've been called Thor before. Well, he lived up to his nickname and the pace that he set for us on his hikes. He would get so far ahead of us and then stop graciously and wait for us to catch up with him. But when we got there, he started all over again. We never even had time to rest for 2 days. We didn't even catch a breath on a hike. He was killing us. Steve and I sat in a tent on like the second night. He's like, we got to talk to this kid. I mean, something has to happen. So at the end of day 2, Thor and I had a chat. All right, we got a little math lesson that needs to take place here. First of all, it takes me 2 steps to mark you're 1. Second, you're 24. I'm almost 48. That is 2 times. 2's coming into play here. 2 to 1. That's coming in. That's the math lesson here. Number 3, you're Thor and I'm a pastor. Slow down. He laughed. He kindly obliged, but his slow down pace was still pushing us to its limits. Hiking in the blistering cold with rain that turned to sleet and snow and wind gusts that reached 40 miles an hour one day, literally sideways snow, 60-mile-an-hour winds you're leaning into with the 50-pound pack on your back, crazy elevation changes, unstable ground, all of that after I've had 2 reconstructive knee surgeries was incredibly taxing. There was more than once on the trip with my swollen and aching knees, I didn't think I could, I'm like, I'm not going to make it back. I don't know how I can do this. And all of those moments came when we seemed to be the furthest away from some kind of shelter. Miles, which meant hours of hiking away from camp. And on one of those instances, I made the mistake of trying to encourage myself because my legs were fatigued, I was tired, and I'm thinking, I just need to look back to see where I've come from. Maybe I will gain some encouragement. And it defeated me because all the time and energy I'd put to get to this point, when I turned and looked where we had been, it looked like we were still right there. So then I thought, well, let me turn and look where we're going. I'll look ahead, and then I looked up and saw the peak of the mountain and realized it's still an hour till we get there, and camp is 2 hours or an hour on the other side of that. So the past was defeating and the future was demoralizing, and I didn't know what to do. It seemed impossible. So I had to make the decision to break the journey down into one manageable step at a time. I couldn't look back where I'd been. I couldn't look ahead to where I was going. The past was defeating. The future seemed impossible. So I had to just focus on the next step, the next footprint in the snow. I couldn't change the past, and I can't control the future, but I can take one more step. And I had to break it down to just one step at a time, one step at a time. I can do that. I can take one more step. And as I walked one painful step of time, the piece of wisdom from Ecclesiastes 9 popped in my head. I didn't remember it being from Ecclesiastes 9. I remembered it from the book of Ecclesiastes. Couldn't give you the exact verse at that time. But while I hiked up the side of that mountain, these words came to my mind. The race is not to the swift or the battle to the strong. It's not about my speed. It's not about my strength. It's about my patience, persistence, and perseverance. I just have to keep putting one foot in front of the other, one moment at a time. And as I painfully walk this out, I realize this truth applies to so many other areas of life. This is the way through grief. This is the way out of addiction. This is how you get out of debt, restore a broken marriage, rebuild a shattered life, or simply live for God. You can't be defeated by the past or demoralized by a challenging and unknown future. You can't change the past. You can't control the future. The only thing you have any influence over is the present, the right now, this very moment. So just take the very next step, as painful as it may be. One small step at a time, done over and over again, repetitiously, can actually eventually lead you to momentary life change. The race of life isn't won by the swift or the strong, but by the patient, the persistent, and the persevering, who simply choose to conquer life one small, consistent step in the right direction, one at a time. Scottish historian Thomas Carlyle, way back in the 1800s, said this: "Our grand business undoubtedly is not to see what lies dimly at a distance, but to do what lies clearly at hand." Just take the next step. Plod on. One small step at a time. William Osler founded the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and is known as the father of modern medicine. In 1913, he addressed the student body at Yale University, and in his speech, he admitted intellectual averageness. He said that his success in life did not come because of his natural abilities, his intelligence, or an elite education. But his success in life was the byproduct of taking the hard next step over and over again without having any idea what the future held. But he was consistently persevering in the moment, one step at a time, and it led him to where he was at that time. In that speech, William Osler said, "The load of tomorrow added to that of yesterday, carried today, makes the strongest falter." That makes sense. Because we get overwhelmed by yesterday's mistakes and we get overwhelmed by tomorrow's opportunity. When we look back to where we've been and how much effort we put in and how little progress we've made, it's overwhelming. When we look forward to the future, we feel incredibly unqualified. It's why so many people give up and quit. Quit on God, quit on a marriage, quit on sobriety, quit on a dream. So stop looking to the history of yesterday and stop being overwhelmed by the mystery of tomorrow and just look straight down in front of you and take the next step. You can't change the past. You can't control the future, but you can take one more step. Just take the next step. Wake up tomorrow and just take the next step. And if you do that enough days in a row, it can change your life. The race isn't to the swift or the battle to the strong. It's to the ones who get up every day and consistently put one foot in front of the other in the right direction. Don't quit. Don't give up. Just take the next step. That concept of seizing daily moments is woven all throughout the Bible. In the most famous prayer ever prayed, Jesus is teaching us how to pray in the Lord's Prayer. And how does he pray? Give us this day our daily bread. He didn't say give us this week our weekly bread. He didn't say give us this year our annual bread. Give us this day our daily bread. I mean, it would have been so much more convenient if he would have just said, yeah, give us this year our yearly bread, and we'd have come to church on Christmas, prayed a prayer, got a download that would sustained us for a year. But it didn't work that way because that's not the way God designed life. The prayer isn't that way because the way life is designed is for you and I to be dependent on God in the everyday, daily steps, to learn to trust him for today's bread. Just take the next step. Do you remember the expiration date on the Old Testament manna? One day. Do you know the deadline that God set for our anger? Sundown. Do you know when God's mercies are made new? Every morning. Do you know how often we're told to take up our crosses? Daily. And when does Scripture tell us to rejoice and be glad? Today. God has broken so many things down to what we do today, in this moment, the right now, the present. So don't be imprisoned to the past. Don't be paralyzed by fear over the future. Just take the next step today. Matthew Barnett is a personal friend and co-founder with his dad, Tommy Barnett. They founded the Los Angeles Dream Center. And every dream center you see around the world today was spawned out of the Los Angeles Dream Center. It was the first and the mother of all of them. It's in the old Angeles Temple Hospital there, and Matthew and his team rescue people off the streets of LA that are trying to overcome life-controlling addictions and rebuild their lives one way or another. Maybe prostitutes or gang members or dealers or homeless, whatever. And no matter what brings them to the Dream Center, no matter what habits they're trying to break or what goals they are going after, Matthew asks every one of them the same question. Can you do it for a day? That's it. He has to break it down into a manageable step, because when they're controlled by so much and their life is at such rock bottom, they can't think about tomorrow. They can't think about a week or a month or a year from now. So he asked them, just focus on the next 24 hours. Can you do it for a day? Just take the next step. So many of our problems are left unresolved And so many of our habits are left unbroken. So many of our goals are left unachieved because we're overwhelmed by the size of the problem or the size of the habit or the size of the goal. So stop focusing on the outcome and start focusing on the input. Stop focusing on the goal and start focusing on developing consistent daily habits. Break it down to one step at a time and just take the next step. By the end of January, 75% of people fail to keep their New Year's resolutions. If you don't believe that, go to the gym on January the 3rd, you can't find a treadmill. Go to the gym on January the 30th, you got all you want. Why? Because when you think in 1 year time frames, the finish line is so far away that you can't even see it. We would make so much more ground if we just focused on today's next step instead of tomorrow's long-term goal. I don't know what problem you're trying to solve, what habit you're trying to break, what pain you're trying to navigate, or what God-sized goal you're going after. But what God whispered to me in the wilderness has the potential to change all of our lives. When your past is defeating and the future goal is so far off, it feels demoralizing. Just keep your head down and take the next step. The race isn't to the swift or the battle to the strong. It goes to the patient, persistent, and persevering ones who choose to keep their heads down and grind it out one small, consistent step at a time. And if you do that enough days in a row, it'll change you. The wisdom writer in Ecclesiastes isn't the only biblical writer to compare living this life for God to that of running a long race. Several do it. Matter of fact, the Apostle Paul takes it a step further. He compares living the Christian life to running a marathon or even being in a boxing match. He uses those two images of living the Christian life, being in a boxing match and running a marathon, because he wants you to understand when you read his writing that the Christian life is going to be full of adversity. That is a given. It's how you respond to that adversity that makes the difference. The people of Paul's day were very familiar with what we all know as the Olympic Games. And Paul capitalizes on that imagery to drive home some powerful spiritual truths. Listen to what he writes in 1 Corinthians 9. Listen. Verse 24, don't you realize that in a race everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize? So run to win. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it for an eternal prize. So I run with purpose in every step. I am not shadow boxing. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. Which leaves me with a question. After reading Paul, how then shall we run? How does Paul say we're supposed to run this race of life? The answer, like an Olympic athlete. They run to win. They run with a competitive edge. They run with passion and zeal. They run with training, discipline, and self-control. They run with purpose and intentionality. And Paul says they do all of that to win an earthly crown that will fade away. But our motivation for running this race is to win an eternal prize. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away. But we do it for an eternal prize. Here's what Paul is saying. The adversity and the pain of your life can be bridled, tempered, and put into perspective when you have eternity in mind. Athletes put their minds and their bodies through all kinds of pain and misery to prepare themselves for competition. And they're able to do it because winning matters more to them than their personal comfort. And they do it all to win a perishable, temporary crown. And if they do all that for a medal, and in Paul's day it would have been a laurel wreath, literally made out of plants, that would have died a few hours after it was awarded. If they do all of that for a perishable wreath, how much more motivated should we be knowing that we are running the race of life to obtain an imperishable, incorruptible, eternal crown? So let the reality of heaven, the promise of seeing Jesus face to face, the eternal prize, let that be your motivation. Let the long-term approach of eternity fuel your life today. Don't look to where you've been. Don't look to the next mountaintop as the goal. Keep your head down and just take the next step. One step at a time, you are marching toward an eternal crown. It reminds me of the African American slaves that lived lives of total misery that were inflicted upon them. And the way they maintained their sanity was to pen songs. They sang often in the monotony and misery of their life. Swing down, swing low, sweet chariots coming forth to carry me home. The reality of an eternal crown tempered the adversity of their everyday life. It bridled, it gave them perspective because they knew they were running to win something that would make all of this fade away, an eternal crown. We sang a song during worship that may have been new to you. It paints a picture of the Father making room through His incredible grace for some really unworthy people like you and I in heaven. We sang about this incredibly beautiful homecoming and reunion that we're going to have. The songwriters are just trying to imagine out loud what it's going to be like when we walk into the beauty of heaven. In case you missed it, he writes, I see bright crimson robes draped over the ashes, a wide open tomb where there should be a casket. The children are singing and dancing and laughing. The Father is welcoming. This is our homecoming. Roses in bloom pushed up from the embers. Rivers of tears flow from good times remembered. Families are singing and dancing and laughing. The Father is welcoming. This is our homecoming. Heaven joins in with a glorious sound, and the great cloud of witnesses all gather round, because the ones that were lost are finally found. The Father is welcoming. This is our homecoming. One of the preachers, late, great preacher that's in heaven today, that shaped my life early on is a man by the name of B.H. Clendenin. If I mention his name and you go look up a sermon, prepare to get offended. B.H. Clendenin was not politically correct. He would preach the paint off the walls and the hide off your skin. The only time in my life I've ever been preached from my chair, sitting upright, under conviction, onto my knees, onto my face, and wept a puddle in the tile floor of an auditorium, praying, Dear God, have mercy on my life, was under the ministry of B.H. Clendenin. In that very sermon that day, his text was Paul's admonishment to Timothy, where Paul told Timothy, Thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier in Christ Jesus. And if anybody knew about hardness as a soldier, it was B.H. Clendenin. He was a Marine in World War II, wounded in battle, awarded a Purple Heart when he got home. And on that day, in that sermon that day, he painted a picture of the homecoming he received at New York Harbor. He said, I was in the infirmary. I'd been shot. All of us guys there, we were maimed, mauled, blown up. Some of us didn't have limbs and faces disfigured. And the war ended while I was in the infirmary, so they put us on a ship loaded with soldiers, wounded soldiers, and they were sending us home. It was going to take weeks for us to get home from where we were. And he said, as we got into the trip, we didn't know how much further we had left. And we would all limp our way up to the top deck of the ship, and we would look for land because we just wanted to be home. We missed our mamas. We missed our families. You can't imagine what we had seen, what we had done, what we had been through. We just wanted to go home. It seemed like eternity crossing that ocean. He said, but as we got word we were getting close, I wanted to look good. So he said, I only had one pair of pants. And I would put one leg under the mattress one night to put a crease in it. And I'd put another leg under the mattress the other night to put a crease in it. Because when I got off that ship, I wanted to look the best I could. He said, as we started to pull in New York Harbor, I could see throngs and masses, a sea of people gathered around the edge of that harbor. And he said, I could see the band playing, but I couldn't hear it over the roar of the ship. Confetti was flying. You could tell people were singing. And as we got closer, they were singing from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. He said, when they lowered that plank and they let us off that boat, he said, grown women I'd never seen in my life, old enough to be my mama, were hugging me and kissing me, saying, welcome home, soldier. And little pretty girls were walking up, kissing me on the cheek, saying, welcome home, you're a hero. He said the music, the people, the throng, the welcome was the most moving thing I'd ever been a part in my life as I leapt off that boat. But then he stopped with tears in his eyes. He said, but that homecoming is going to pale in comparison to the day the good old gospel ship sails into the celestial sea of heaven and we catch a glimpse of the blood-washed throng of the redeemed that are gathered on the shores of celestial sea, and the band is playing and the choir of the redeemed is singing, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are standing there to welcome us home. But the throng of people parts when the eyes is flame of fire and the hair is white as wool, and the one that holds a name no man has ever held before starts to part the crowd, because I'm going to lay my eyes on Jesus for the first time, and it will be worth it all in that moment. Come on, stand with me if you will for a moment. I just want you to imagine, come on, be a kid for a minute and just play like for a minute what it's going to be like. Let eternity calibrate your life. I know it's hard. I know your heart's broken. You don't have to worry about the next mountaintop or the next goal, but run to obtain a prize. And if running for you is just taking that painful next step, let the promise of heaven give you the strength just to step one more time. Run to win the prize. Come on.